era contundente. Estaba dispuesto a hacerlo. Estaba dispuesto a estar en esto.
He was the right man, and he was prepared to do it.
Pero bueno,
He was prepared to do a lot of things.
¿usted cree que se puede contactar con
It would have made no sense to contact him otherwise.
de predisposición? Era un resentimiento.
His motive was bitter resentment.
On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was on his way to kill President John F. Kennedy. Paris. With eerie symmetry, another would-be assassin set off here the very same day for a clandestine briefing with his CIA liaison officer. This man's target was Fidel Castro, whom he was to kill and replace as Cuba's head of state. His contractor, Robert Kennedy. His name, Rolando Cubela.
I'm a doctor, and I said, you have to eliminate a malignant tumor. You can't heal it. The whole arm has to go. Castro has a cancerous tumor. It was a medical problem.
Eso tiene que ver con la medicina.
The idea of the poison pen came to me after I talked to our doctor, whose job was to provide medical support. The idea was to stick Castro with the pen filled with black leaf 40, a poison to apply against roots of plants. That's all. You put a little too much in and you killed the plant.
Dallas, 7:30 a.m. Oswald headed downtown. President Kennedy paid a last official public visit in nearby Fort Worth.
Couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it then.
Just before 8 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald arrived at his workplace, the Texas School Book Depository. The murder weapon was in the back seat of the car, wrapped in paper. On this morning, John F. Kennedy said to his wife, "Jackie, if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it?"
Cubano took this poison in Paris 22nd of November 63, the same day the president was shot.
Well, at least he was shot and he didn't die of poison. There's a difference.
¿Centro Comercial de Cuba? Luisa, sí. Oye, ¿ya sabes la noticia? ¿Cuál? ¿De ¿Ya hacía ya? ¿Cuándo sucedió eso? A las 13 horas. ¿Qué hora era eso? La 1. ¡Coño! ¡Qué rico! Vieja, ¿por qué? Coño, ¿acá? Y al hermano le hirieron y la señora está herida también. ¡Qué rico! ¿Verdad tú? Ay, vieja. Qué bueno está eso. ¡Qué rico! ¿Y tú sabes la consecuencia que puede tener eso? Buenísimo. Bueno, en ese sentido, de que padre sí. Pero es que un degenerado, un desgraciado, un agresor, aparte de la política que hay con Cuba y eso, pues bueno, eso es aparte. Me dieron 3 tiros en la cara. Perfecto.
Pero ¿qué tal, Wichi?
¿Qué tal, chico?
¿Cómo has estado?
Bien.
¿Ya sabes la última noticia?
Sí, claro, me enteré casi antes que Kenny.
Parece que aprendieron a un tipo
Sí, ya.
que es nada menos que presidente de uno de los comités del trato limpio con Cuba.
Sí, ya también me enteré. Oye, era gringo tipo, ¿no?
¿Sí? ¿Sí, el que lo mató?
Sí.
Sí, que había estado en Rusia, que quería que nacionalizarse ruso, pero que Rusia no le había querido dar la nacionalización.
Oye, como ya sabe cosas, cara. ¿No se sabe quién es todavía?
¿Eh?
¿No se sabe quién es?
Pues sí, es un Oswin, o no sé, Oswin. Sí, por ahí va. No lo recuerdo exactamente. Es de ese tipo, pero bueno, se cree que es él, ¿eh? Él no ha confesado nada. Bueno, hasta luego.
Just hours after the assassination, an unregistered small plane took off from the private Dallas airport, Redbird. The identity of the single passenger on board would eventually be revealed confidentially to Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson.
The plane flew from Dallas to Mexico, and the occupant transferred to a Cuban airplane. The occupant was Fabian Escalante, one of the top aides to Fidel Castro.
A secret dossier for Johnson's eyes only, never before disclosed until now. The man who compiled it, LBJ's confidant, Martin Underwood, gave us the report under the condition that we make it public only after his death. We're in Havana to look for clues. If it can be confirmed that Escalante, head of operations of the Cuban Secret Service, was at the scene of the crime in Dallas, it would open up a whole new politically explosive avenue in the case of the Kennedy assassination. Was there a connection between Castro's revolutionary government and Lee Harvey Oswald? If this suspicion were to prove true, the history of the Cold War would have to be revised. We've contacted General Escalante himself to ask him directly. He finally makes himself available, and we ask him what business might have brought him to Dallas back then, on the very day Kennedy was shot.
¿Y quién dice que ese documento es cierto?
Who says this document is genuine?
Estamos viviendo un mundo.
We live in a world where today, something is no longer true that only yesterday seemed certain.
Hoy no lo es. Hay hoy personas.
There are intelligent people who doubt the authenticity of the picture of the American moon landing. Were they really on the moon? Apparently, yes, but I'm not so sure.
¿Estaban en la luna realmente? Al parecer sí, pero yo no tengo la certeza de que todo eso sea cierto. Porque es que si hay
so much is forged and falsified. What is true? What's a lie?
¿Qué cosa es verdad y qué cosa es mentira?
One day we'll know whether or not the Americans really did land on the moon, and if Oswald shot Kennedy.
What do you think?
There were several snipers. Whether they were North Americans, Japanese, Chinese, or Germans, I don't know, because I wasn't there.
O alemanes. No, yo no sé. Yo no estaba ahí. No tengo la menor idea.
Or your people did it?
Out of the question. We had no reason to be.
After all, Kennedy was your mortal enemy.
That's not enough. We have the ethics and morals of our revolution. We've only survived. We have been victorious over the world's largest empire for over 40 years because the strongest weapons of our socialist revolution are its solid, fundamental moral and ethical principles.
The war against Cuba began in April 1961, when a brigade of Cuban exiles with U.S. military support attacked at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was effectively beaten back, and President Kennedy, then only 3 months in office, was forced to concede a humiliating defeat. He paid a ransom to free 1,100 surviving brigadiers from Cuban captivity.
For your small brigade is a tangible reaffirmation that although Castro and his fellow dictators may rule nations, they do not rule people. That they may imprison bodies, but they do not imprison spirits. That they may destroy the exercise of liberty, but they cannot eliminate the determination to be free. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
Los gusanos, los privilegiados, los parásitos y los hijos de los parásitos que quieran enarbolar la bandera vergonzosa del crimen y de la traición a la patria, sepan que no se van a enfrentar con señoritos, sepan que se van a enfrentar con hombres.
The Bay of Pigs debacle left Kennedy determined to get rid of Castro by other means. He authorized a covert war against Cuba. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, headed the Cuba Committee to coordinate the war.
I participated in that as a covert action as a young major, assigned to Cy Vance, who was then Secretary of the Army. There were a number of programs which I can describe that would tell you that was bound to provoke Castro. For example, the conduct of 3 raids a week against Cuba itself, where bridges were demolished, sugar mills, other facilities of the Cuban infrastructure. Bobby Kennedy, I am confident with the knowledge of his brother, it had to be that way because it was so serious, conducted at least 8 attempts to assassinate Castro. Now, during our covert program that I was involved with, which was the raids against mainland Cuba, we were constantly warned by reports from Havana, from Castro himself, that stop.
Rolando Cubela was Kennedy's man in Havana. The plan was for this commandant of the Cuban Revolution to seize power and eliminate Fidel Castro in the process. Together with Che Guevara, Cubela had taken the capital Havana in 1959. But when Castro later embraced communism, Cubela secretly began to plan a coup d'etat with the help of the CIA and their health department. We tracked Cubela down in Madrid. A mysterious man, he managed to avoid ever facing charges in Cuba for the planned assassination by poison of Fidel Castro.
Hola. Don Rolando. Hola. What was the story with the poison?
Ah, bueno, no, pero eso fue una cosa que... Eso que es una cosa que inventaron, yo no leo.
That was their invention. They told me that's how it should be done. I said, no, that doesn't interest me. It was a sort of pen with a projectile. I wanted real weapons from Kennedy for the fight in Cuba, and he sent weapons to our commandant there, Ramon Guin.
You personally were prepared to kill Castro?
I wasn't the best shot. We had experts for that.
But you were responsible.
Yes, I don't deny that.
Kubela is a traitor. The CIA is a snake, and it bites by nature. But we knew that Kubela wanted to kill Castro. He was a double agent. Such is the game of espionage.
Oscar Marino. For the first time, a former senior member of the Cuban Secret Service agency G2 gives evidence relating to the Kennedy assassination. He wants future generations to know the truth, enough to put his own life at risk for it.
La imagen de Kennedy, no cabe duda, es para muchos un paladín en Latinoamérica.
Kennedy was a popular hero in Latin America, but not for Cuba. For us Cubans, he was the counter-revolution personified.
Era la contra-revolución.
Fidel Castro was better informed than the CIA suspected about the secret war fought against him by the Kennedy brothers. Antulio Ramirez. He infiltrated anti-Castro groups in the U.S. When his cover was blown, he had to beat a quick retreat to Havana, seizing control of a passenger plane from Miami for the purpose. Ramirez was the world's first airplane hijacker and a key witness.
I went into the cockpit and asked the pilots, "Where are you flying?" They named some destination or other, and I said, "No, that's out. You'll have to take me to Cuba first." I sent one of the pilots to the back and stayed with the other one alone, and he took me to Cuba.
Havana was still basking in the glory of the first victory over U.S. imperialism. Antulio Ramirez received a hero's welcome and took up residence in the command headquarters of the Secret Service agency G2.
They trusted me because I had brought them the airplane.
Did G2 officers touch the subject Kennedy?
Yes, and I also saw several documents. But I never mentioned that. I wanted to stay out of trouble.
But how did they speak about Kennedy?
They wanted to eliminate him.
Ramirez's Cuban diary.
Al retornar mi expediente, otro me llamó la atención por el segundo apellido que tenía.
As I was putting my own personal file away, another one caught my eye, titled Oswaldo Kennedy.
Titulado Osvaldo Kennedy. Oswald Kennedy. Osvaldo Kennedy. Decía,
In the file, it said, the Russian Secret Service, KGB, recommends an individual to us called Lee Harvey Oswald, a North American.
Pero sin mucha insistencia. Es norteamericano casado con una agente del organismo.
He is married to a Soviet Secret Service agent who has been ordered to settle in the USA. Oswald is a high-strung adventurer. Our embassy in Mexico has been instructed to contact him. Caution.
Mucho cuidado.
Ramirez's statement is a sensational revelation. The consensus until now has been that the KGB lost all interest in Lee Harvey Oswald after he left the Soviet Union for good in the summer of 1962. To substantiate Ramirez's claims, we meet with a high-ranking officer of the Russian Secret Service Agency, FSB, in Austria, alias Nikolai. He has access to the encrypted KGB archives.
Nikolai, was the Cuban Secret Service told by the KGB about Lee Harvey Oswald's availability?
Yes, they were informed.
Can that be proven?
Yes, there is a document in the archive.
What's in it?
It's a telegram to the head of Cuban Secret Services, Ramiro Valdez, dated July 18, 1962, signed by the deputy head of the KGB, Kuchkov. It says Oswald leaving USSR together with his wife. Cuban Secret Service requested to take up surveillance of this individual. He is ideologically unsound and psychologically unstable.
Mire, eso es falso. Ese telegrama es apócrifo. Eso es totalmente falso. Es decir, en ningún momento.
Completely false. A forgery. I venture to state that quite clearly. You can also ask Comandante Ramiro Valdez. He is, now as then, one of the leaders of our country.
Pero usted tenga la total y completa seguridad.
That telegram is a fake. The simple fact that I would have seen it is proof enough.
What is false, the telegram or the KGB?
That's what I'd like to know. Do you know if the Americans really did land on the moon?
We are not talking about the CIA here, but about the KGB archives.
Claro, lo que pasa es el archivo de la KGB es el archivo de la KGB. Bueno, los archivos de la KGB eran de la KGB hasta cierto momento, estimado amigo.
Very well, but the KGB was only master of its own archives up to a certain point in time, my good friend.
Sobre la crisis de octubre, la crisis de los misiles. Y por cierto, me entrevisté ahí con el.
I was in Moscow in 1994 at a conference on the missile crisis. I spoke there with the head of the Soviet Communist Party archives. He told me that a group of American researchers worked in the archives of the Communist Party and the KGB. How many documents might they have planted there? I don't know. But I know what the American Secret Service is capable of.
You mean the CIA smuggled the telegram from 1962 into the KGB archives 30 years later?
Is there any other explanation?
Lee Harvey Oswald. In the winter of 1959, the North American communist went into Soviet exile and found work in a radio factory in Minsk. With his exceptionally high intelligence, he quickly learned Russian. He read Dostoevsky and other classics and knew entire Russian opera librettos by heart. At a dance at a cultural center, He met Marina Prusakova, and the couple were married a short time later. But a damper was soon thrown on his enthusiasm for Soviet communism. He also hated the cold, the mindless work, and the bureaucracy. In June 1962, he returned to the United States with his wife Marina and their daughter June. On the crossing to New York, he kept a diary.
We have lived in a dark generation of tension and fear. I have lived under both systems. I have sought the answers, and although it would be very easy to dupe myself into believing one system is better than the other, I know they are not. The mass of survivors will be too disillusioned to support either the communists or the capitalist parties after the atomic catastrophe. They shall seek an alternative to those systems which have brought them misery. I intend to put forward just such an alternative.
Oswald headed for Fort Worth near Dallas. There, he and his family could live with his brother Robert. He found work in a print shop. His friends saw him as a political dreamer and an incurable, starry-eyed idealist. No one suspected he was leading a double life. The KGB telegram to Havana had been effective.
When did you first hear of Lee Harvey Oswald?
1962, when he was contacted. In November 1962,
Contacted in November 62?
yes, I know no more than that.
By G2?
Yes, of course. We didn't choose him because he was the best. He was available. We needed people. We believed in the revolution and were determined to export it. And just imagine someone in the USA.
In March 1963, Oswald bought a mail-order gun and planned his first assassination. His victim also lived in Dallas, the right-wing extremist general Edwin Walker. Oswald put Walker's house under his own surveillance, taking photos and making sketches. General Walker had gained notoriety during the racial unrest at Ole Miss University. He led the white mob in a confrontation as they tried to put a violent halt to the admission of black students to the university. President Kennedy sent 2,000 National Guard troops to ensure that the first black student at Ole Miss was able to complete the registration process unharmed.
We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise.
Oswald saw Walker as America's Hitler, and finally on April 10th took a shot at him through a window. Walker survived, the bullet just grazing his head. Only after the Kennedy assassination did the FBI discover, following an admission by Oswald's wife, that Oswald was the marksman. Oswald had now passed his first test as a recruit in the World Revolution. He had been cold-blooded enough to plan a political assassination. After the assassination attempt, the Oswalds moved to New Orleans, Lee's birthplace.
And I think he really enjoys when he does some good thanks for me. And he want to be the same way all the time. But next day, he think about his Cuba again, this book. And I feel looks like this was two people, one person.
New Orleans was the center of activity for counter-revolutionary Cuban exile groups. They maintained training camps in the surrounding swamplands and plotted commando raids on Cuba, financed by the CIA. Lee found an apartment on Magazine Street and work in the Riley Coffee Factory. Oswald devoted his spare time after work to new political activities. He established a Fair Play for Cuba committee and printed revolutionary handbills. He also attempted to infiltrate Cuban exile groups.
Oswald introduced himself and said he wanted to support our fight against Castro.
Entonces él se expresó muy en contra de Castro.
He claimed to have had military experience in the Marines and could give my people military training. I said no. We fight with propaganda, not with weapons. A week later, my friend Celso came to me and said, the North American is distributing handbills on Canal Street that say, long live Fidel, and hands off Cuba.
Hands off Cuba, y que estaba repartiendo una propaganda a favor de Castro. Eso fue como aquí.
He stood right here. Celso grabbed the handbills from him and tore them up.
Los rompió y los tiró al aire. Eran unos panfletos amarillos que decía Hands of Cuba. Yo me quité los espejuelos para pegarle un trompón a Oswald. Cuando él vio que yo...
I took my glasses off and was about to throw a punch. When he saw that, he lowered his arms and said,
Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me.
Y Carlos Bringuier tiene una disputa con Oswald. Llega la policía, los detiene a todos. Y ahí mismo es donde se...
This Carlos Bringuier fights with Oswald on the street corner until the police show up. Afterwards, the two of them are invited to take part in a radio debate on the 21st of August.
Hubiera sido de las cosas más normales del mundo.
You can imagine something like that happening in 2005, but in 1963... Because of a tussle over a few handbills, a debate with a madman who claims to be a devotee of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the debate was meant to serve later as proof that Oswald was a die-hard communist fighter.
Que después del 22 de noviembre se van a utilizar para demostrar que Oswald era un veterano luchador comunista. Todo eso fue creado artificialmente.
All of that was staged. That was the role Lee Harvey Oswald had to play in New Orleans.
Y esa es la estadía de Oswald en Nueva Orleans.
Was Carlos Bringuier part of the show or just being used?
No, he was an active participant. He's a CIA agent.
On the local New Orleans radio show, the Cuban exiles did their best to expose Oswald, but he skillfully stood his ground.
How many people do you have on your committee here in New Orleans?
I cannot reveal that as secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba committee.
Well, the Republicans are in the minority. I don't see them hiding their membership.
Well, the Republicans are an established political party representing a great many people. They represent no radical point of view. they do not have a very violent and sometimes emotional opposition as we do.
Mr. Oswald, are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior to this program on another radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily the difference between a country like Ghana, Guyana, Yugoslavia, China, or Russia. Many countries are based on Marxism. Many countries, such as Great Britain, display very socialistic aspects and characteristics. I might point to the socialized medicine of Britain.
Most people. Gentlemen, I'll have to interrupt. We'll be back in a moment to continue this rather lively discussion after this message.
Lee wasn't satisfied with his propaganda duties. He found his petty bourgeois life in New Orleans unbearably tedious. He wanted to fight on the front lines, like Fidel and Che Guevara. And he announced to his wife Marina, "I'm going to Cuba as a soldier of the revolution."
I know Lee, he don't tell me his plan about Cuba, because I don't know why. The first time he wanted to try to steal, not to steal, to see airplane and go to Cuba. And first time he wanted himself. And I told him, Lee, you can't do this. Anyway, I don't want he do this. But I told him, just don't do this because he can't. He's not so strong, man, to do this himself. And he told me, okay, you help me. And, you know, I said, how? And he explained to me how he wanted if I be in an airplane with him and hold his gun. And I told him I just scared to death to hold his gun. And it'd be a very funny story, very funny picture for everybody who pay attention. A pregnant woman with one child and hold this gun. And I left and I don't take this serious. And he was so upset about this.
On September 25, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald traveled by bus from New Orleans to Mexico City. On the same day, the Kennedy administration's special group on Cuba met to embark on a new program of sabotage against Castro's Cuba. Before leaving, Oswald told his wife Marina he was going to Cuba forever. She and their daughter June should return to live in the Soviet Union. But things would turn out quite differently. Lee would indeed return to the USA 6 days later on a mission that was to change the world.
Mexico City may be compared to Pandora's box. Mexico City held secrets that were never explored and remain a mystery today. This was very closely classified information considered secret. I was told not to speak about my trip to Mexico City. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, decided that I should go to Mexico City to coordinate the investigation that should be done.
After the Kennedy assassination, FBI supervisor Lawrence Keenan came here to Mexico City to find out what Lee Harvey Oswald had been doing here and who his contacts were.
Bueno, amigo, suerte.
The criminal trial revisited. Hotel Comercio, where Oswald stayed for $1.28 a night. Now a room costs $6.50 a night. Other than that, nothing much has changed.
I'd like to see Lee Harvey Oswald's room.
Lee Harvey Oswald. ¿Tenéis la llave?
Yes, but you'll have to pay for it first.
Bueno, tengo el dinero.
I have the money here.
Mucho dinero, ¿ah? Oh, algo. ¿Es todo? Bueno. Bueno, muchas gracias.
It's on the third floor.
Bueno. Muy bonito.
In 1963, the trail of the assassin was still fresh. But Keenan's investigation was halted after just 3 days, on orders from headquarters in Washington.
When he arrived from Dallas, he arrived at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, and he prepared to visit the Cuban consulate. He had the intention of receiving a visitor's tourist visa from the Cubans.
Sylvia Duran, a Mexican communist in the service of Cuba, received Oswald at the Cuban embassy. She now lives in a gated community in Mexico City. Oswald is a taboo subject for her. Traumatic, as she says. A filmed interview? No. But she does give us some information over the telephone.
He screamed and became enraged because he wasn't given a visa right away. Do you really think I would have had any further contact with a lunatic like that? No, certainly not. Of course not. His Mexican visa was close to expiring and he went crazy because we wouldn't issue him a visa. We threw him out, he went, and that's all. I don't know anything else.
Since 1963, Sylvia Duran has maintained that Oswald had contact with the visa department of the Cuban embassy only and had been thrown out by the ambassador. It sounds plausible, but it's not true. Our 2 years of research revealed that Oswald led a double life in Mexico City. He met repeatedly with Cuban functionaries and agents, and also with Sylvia Duran, among others. For example, at a party at the home of a senior Mexican Communist Party official. The daughter of Nobel Prize-winning Mexican author Octavio Paz remembers.
Nos fuimos de la fiesta con Horacio, el hermano de Lidia, y su mujer Silvia, que trabajaba en el consulado de Cuba.
I went to the party with Horacio and his wife Sylvia, who worked at the Cuban embassy. Oswald sat with two friends at the fireside. My Aunt Dia said, "Go ask those funny gringos to dance." I didn't like Oswald's face. He was chilly.
Did he dance with you?
No. He just said no. No, very rude.
No. Muy grosero.
Who did Oswald come to the party with?
Sylvia. Yes. He didn't speak to anyone.
How do you know that Sylvia invited him?
Yo le pregunté.
I asked Horacio and Sylvia, and she said I did. Horacio added, "Don't even talk about him. He's dangerous."
We have got some things to clear up with Sylvia Duran. You did have contact with Oswald outside the embassy.
No, absolutely no contact. I was married and would never have got involved with a madman like Oswald.
If you didn't have anything to do with him, why were you arrested and beaten?
Because they found my telephone number in his notebook. That's no reason, of course, but tell that to the Mexican police after the American president has been murdered. Your questions are insulting.
The FBI did not interrogate Sylvia Duran during its investigations in Mexico. Many others who were known to have had contact with Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City were not questioned either.
This was perhaps the worst investigation the FBI had ever been involved in. I realized I was used. I felt ashamed that we missed a moment in history.
A visit to the Mexican Central Archives. This is also the storage depot for the files of the Mexican Secret Service Agency, DFS, whose officers had arrested Sylvia Duran after Kennedy's death. Maybe we'll find out here why Sylvia Duran isn't telling the truth. What is she afraid of? The Secret Service file Lee Harvey Oswald is 4,000 pages long and includes surveillance reports, photos, and interrogation transcripts. We're only allowed to read 30 pages. Still, we are the first to examine these files.
The matter of Lee Harvey Oswald and Sylvia Duran. That's important. It says here, the interrogation, the following questions are to be put to Sylvia Duran. Identity of the Cuban officers who were sent to plot the murder of President Kennedy.
El presidente Kennedy.
Which of these officers had contact with Oswald?
Tuvo contacto con Oswald. Identity.
Identity of the black man with reddish hair and a scar on his cheek who turned up at the Cuban embassy. Does he work there? Details?
En la embajada cubana.
After Sylvia Duran's arrest, the Cuban ambassador in Mexico received a call from Havana, from Cuban President Dorticos himself. The CIA was listening too. An undisclosed wiretap recording.
Bueno, encantado, presidente. Buenas tardes.
Another great find. A witness who can confirm that Oswald received money at the Cuban embassy, $6,500, from a black man with reddish hair. Sylvia Duran was there as well. The witness, a young revolutionary, was arrested and mistreated, long enough for him to withdraw his statement.
He was saying something that the FBI did not want to hear.
Did you interview him?
No,
because he said, I saw Oswald receiving money in the Cuban...
No, I didn't interview him.
Didn't you want to?
No. We didn't follow that. No.
Didn't you want to interview him?
No. Never saw him. I asked to. But I was told, forget about it.
But why? He's an important witness, maybe.
Yeah, but the investigation was all over, Willie. It was all decided. At 4 o'clock, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was told, we have found who the subject is. His name is Lee Harvey Oswald. You understand? Hoover had already said it's all over. He was so powerful that his word was law. There was no more investigation. They wanted to close this out, Willie.
Why?
They were afraid of what would happen. They didn't want to know the truth for fear it would mean we go to war. Mm-hmm. The ambassador, when I first went in, I sat down and listened to him. He says it won't be long before the missiles will be flying. The missiles, meaning nuclear missiles. He said this as I put this in the report. See?
When did you get back to the United States? After your Mexican trip? How many days did you spend in
3.5 days.
That's all?
Yeah. I could have gone back the same night, but they wanted to make it look, like I accomplished something, but I didn't.
Vicente Capello, director of the Secret Service Archives, guards the Oswald file like the crown jewels. It contains, among other things, the photo of a Cuban agent who met with Oswald. The picture is marked, Pelo Rojo, the redhead. For reasons of personal data protection, we're not allowed to show the photo on film. The director of the Mexican Central Archives can't help us either. Even she is not authorized to enter Gallery 1, where the Secret Service files are kept.
There's nothing more I can do to help you.
But you're the director.
If it were my decision to make, the problem would be solved. I would give you everything concerning Lee Harvey Oswald, everything.
El asunto Lee Harvey Oswald está más que tratado en el mundo. Yo les daría todo.
Because I don't believe you'll find your trail of evidence running through it. That's my personal opinion. That's one thing. But then there are the regulations that I'm obliged to adhere to, just like Senor Capello and his assistants.
Y sus asistentes es muy diferente.
An unseen force has moved to block our investigation. All access to the Secret Service files has now been withdrawn. Perhaps the Mexican Secret Services are trying to protect themselves. They did, after all, play a part in the cover-up surrounding the murder of the century, along with Cuba and the United States. For the Secret Service agencies of all three of these countries, Oswald, even in death, still remains an uncomfortable figure. On the way to see another witness, Pedro Gutierrez, an accounts inspector who had business at the Cuban embassy, where he crossed paths with Oswald. After the Kennedy assassination, Gutierrez wrote a confidential letter to President Johnson. He had seen Oswald leave the embassy and get into the car of a Cuban functionary. The FBI looked into Gutierrez and came to the conclusion that he was a credible source. But instead of following up on the tip-off, the investigators passed the case on to the Mexican secret police, with dire consequences for the witness. The old address is still valid, mail for Pedro Gutierrez, but our visit is unwelcome.
Don Pedro Gutierrez, habla un momento. No, estoy buscando a Blanca López.
A woman bars the door and claims she doesn't know any Pedro Gutierrez.
Muchas gracias. Voy a esperar.
Finally, she backs down and tells us to come back in 10 minutes.
Muchas gracias, muy amable.
The 10 minutes turn into hours. The door remains closed. In the end, his granddaughter agrees to make a statement, but without the camera. Her grandfather, Pedro Gutierrez, had tremendous problems because of the letter he wrote to Johnson. Cuban agents came to see him and made death threats. He was forced to flee and now lives under an assumed identity in the United States. Even decades later, the name Oswald sparks fear and loathing in the people who had contact with him, or even just saw him. Why are they at risk? After months of preliminary discussions, a former officer of the Cuban G2 Secret Service branch finally agrees to give us a decisive piece of information. In 1963, he was an archivist at the agency's Havana headquarters. His alias, Reynoso.
It was my job to encrypt the files. I had the Lee Harvey Oswald file in my hand. That must have been between 19th and the 21st of June. Of course, I wasn't allowed to open or read it. So I can't say if Oswald was in Cuba or Mexico. I only know that he did meet with G2 officers. His file was kept in the section Foreign Collaborators in the Cuban Revolution.
More evidence that Oswald was already an active Cuban Secret Service agent when he showed up in Mexico. Did his handlers also give him a special contract during the 6 days he spent there? The archivist doesn't know, but maybe our principal witness can tell us.
You ask why we took Oswald? Oswald was a dissident. He hated his country. He possessed certain characteristics. There wasn't anyone else. You take what you can get. Oswald volunteered to kill Kennedy.
Meanwhile, in Washington, Kennedy was unaware of the growing threat. At that point, he was even considering doing a political deal with Castro to put an end to the ongoing conflict. But Robert Kennedy pushed to use force to eliminate Castro. This stance put his brother directly in harm's way. On September 7th, Rolando Cubela got the green light to liquidate Castro. Cubela agreed, but demanded unambiguous confirmation of the assassination order from Robert Kennedy.
Robert Kennedy approved of it?
He didn't want me to speak about it. The subject was avoided. But of course, I told him, Castro is the main obstacle. He must be eliminated.
Bobby was using Cubela, and Cubela told us so. He was being used as a tool by Bobby. Jack had other things to worry about, but Bobby made Cuba and Castro his own field. The Kennedys were different. They always figured out if you're going to win, I suppose, you got to get rid of everything on the other side. And they couldn't understand that why CIA didn't have the capability of doing that. And we had a hard time, I mean, my bosses had a hard time convincing them that, look, hey, the world doesn't run that way. It just doesn't. And they expected if they wanted somebody eliminated, that the CIA could easily eliminate them. And life isn't like that. They had to learn the hard way.
Havana, September 7th. Just hours after Kubela gave his nod to the CIA's request to assassinate Castro, the Cuban head of state knew all the details of Operation Kubela. Presumably, Kubela himself was the informant. He managed to lure Robert Kennedy into a trap. The very same evening, September 7, 1963, Fidel Castro issued a warning to Washington, his final one.
Castro showed up at the reception, and he saw me. He said, "Hey, Colombian, come over here. I want to talk to you." It's clear that he wanted to tell me something. And in the course of that conversation, he touched the subject of the attacks against or the supposed or alleged at that time attacks, or attempted attacks or attempted assassination. He didn't say explicitly assassination. He used the words attacks against him. And there was his warning. And he said something like, el liderazgo de los Estados Unidos debería pensar.
If the U.S. leaders don't stop with their terrorist attacks against me, they could become the target of similar attacks.
Quedarían expuestos a acciones similares.
The fatal events took their course. During that September, several high-ranking agents from Havana traveled to Mexico City. Under protection of the Mexican Secret Services, their movement was unrestricted. Mexico was the hub of activity for the export of the revolution. We are looking for definitive evidence that during this time, Oswald had contact with a Cuban liaison officer. After 2 years of persuasion, a critical witness finally agrees to make an official statement, Antonio. In 1963, he was an officer of the Cuban G2 Secret Service agency, responsible for the security of the embassy compound in Mexico City.
The condition is you don't reveal my name, and my face must not be recognizable. I'm still afraid, even now.
You saw Lee Harvey Oswald?
Once, as he came in through the main entrance, and twice in the embassy parking garage, where he met with a tall, slender black man, a G2 agent.
On different days?
On 2 different days. I can't remember which ones exactly.
What was this agent's name?
Carlos, a black man with red hair.
What was his position?
He was a G2 agent. We almost never saw him at the embassy, but he had access to all the offices.
You know his rank?
An elite officer from very high up.
How did Oswald get into the parking garage?
They were supposed to meet there, so I had to allow Oswald access because he was meeting the black man there. They knew each other.
Black people don't have red hair.
Some do.
Blacks are black. Whites can be red-headed. I had a good laugh when I read your question. Maybe a black person can dye his hair red, but that would be very conspicuous. I wouldn't use someone like that as an agent.
The red-headed black man was a certain Cesar Morales Mesa. He was the one who handed over the money for Oswald.
Did you know him?
Yes. He was from the Santiago region and was in Mexico as a Cuban spy. He also helped the Mexican government with counter-espionage. Based on your description, I have no doubt. He's the one.
Did Fabian Escalante also have contact with Oswald?
I don't know, but presumably. Although I can't say I witnessed it myself. But it has to be assumed that he did. Fabian was very important back then. Something like that couldn't have been carried out without his participation.
I can't tell you how often I've dreamed of traveling to Mexico. A country so rich in tradition. Unfortunately, it never worked out. You can do all the research you like. You won't find any witnesses.
Operation Kennedy was entering the final phase. We know that Oswald was on active duty as an agent of the Cuban G2 as far back as late 1962. We know that Oswald met in Mexico with Cesar Morales Mesa, a high-ranking G2 officer, who passed him operational funds for the preparation of the Kennedy assassination. But Oswald's contacts went even higher up. That is confirmed by a high-ranking Cuban diplomat.
Y yo tengo la información en la memoria de que Fabián Escalante por alguna misión.
I have the information, and I also remember that in 1963, Fabián Escalante was in Mexico on a covert mission in the guise of vice consul. He was the one who received Oswald when he turned up at the Cuban embassy in Mexico.
Esto, lógicamente, abre una ventana tremenda.
That opens a dangerous door, because when Fabián Escalante appears on the scene, you're dealing with a G2 operation of the highest order.
Did the G2 order the assassination of Kennedy?
Let's just say there was a desire.
And Oswald fulfilled that desire?
Yes. Yes. He volunteered. He was so full of hatred that it gave him the idea. But that's the part of the story I don't want to talk about. Let's just say we used him. He adopted our plans as his own. That doesn't mean he was brainwashed. He wanted it too. Is it so important whether or not he acted on his own initiative? He was an instrument. It makes no difference whether he volunteered or was used.
¿Quién podía ordenar eso? ¿Un agente aquí? Who gave the order to kill Kennedy? An agent here or...?
No, that came from the G2 leadership, of course.
Or did it come from Fidel Castro?
That is a subject I don't want to broach, but it came from the G2 leadership in any case. Whether or not it was Castro's decision is a question I cannot and will not answer. But I can say with complete certainty that it was a G2 agency operation.
On October 3, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to the United States. He moved to Dallas, but from then on no longer lived with his family. And he had assumed an alias. By day, he worked in the school book depository. In the evenings, he planned the assassination. Kennedy's visit had been announced weeks before. Oswald scouted out the tall office buildings along the planned route of the presidential motorcade and applied for jobs at several companies located there. Only a few days remained until the assassination. Antulio Ramirez, the hijacker and Cuban agent, learned of Operation Kennedy in a conversation with his liaison officer, Martin, in Havana. A secret he has kept to himself until now.
Nosotros, desde aquí, les vamos a dar el puntillazo final.
Martin said, as far as propaganda goes, we're going to deal the Americans a fatal blow. We're going to kill their president, that jackass Kennedy. Do you want to bet? Before this month of November is out.
De noviembre. Vamos, Martín. No me hagas reír. Ustedes no tienen.
I said, you're pulling my leg. You can't do that. There is no way you can. Besides, the risk for Cuba would be too great, counterproductive in every way. That's impossible. That's just how it'll happen, Martin said. No one will believe it.
Nadie lo creerá.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please. Parkland Hospital, there has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head. The president's wife, Jackie Kennedy, was not hurt. She walked into the hospital at her husband's stretcher side.
Oswald had fulfilled his mission, and Fidel Castro had been saved.
You have been. Nobody said what? Sir? You have been. Nobody said what? Okay. Okay. What did you do in Russia?
A policeman hit me.
The coffin carrying John F. Kennedy's body arrives in Washington, accompanied by brother Robert, Jackie Kennedy, and the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Johnson sincerely feared for his own life. We didn't know what he faced. We didn't know how wide the conspiracy was. President Johnson was determined that he did not want to go to war. He had understood, he was told within 24 hours what was going on with the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Johnson knew that Fidel knew what was going on and that Fidel had the capacity to carry out an assassination.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy.
Within just a few hours, President Johnson had made a political decision. Oswald was a psychopath and was the sole assassin. The trail leading to Havana became a state secret.
Following the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson, he came to Washington immediately. He convened a meeting in Robert McNamara's office, attended by the Cuban Coordinating Committee. And in that meeting, he said, we simply must not allow the American people to believe that Fidel Castro could have killed our president. And the reason was that there would be a right-wing uprising in America which would keep the Democratic Party out of power for 2 generations. He was convinced Castro killed Kennedy, and he took it to his grave. During that meeting, I received a message, which I assume came from the Central Intelligence Agency. I think it did. And in it, it described a visit not just to Mexico, but to Cuba by Lee Harvey Oswald under the auspices of the Mexican Embassy. Now, I brought that message immediately to the meeting because they were dealing with the subject of the Cuban Coordinating Committee and our covert programs, etc. And I was sent a message from that meeting that this was a non-message, that I had not seen it.
But who actually recruited Lee Harvey Oswald for the Cuban Secret Service? Our principal witness saves this stunning revelation for last.
How was Oswald recruited by G2 Secret Service?
Kubela contacted him. I heard in Havana at the time that Oswald had been to Mexico twice. Kubela was in charge of those contacts.
Why Kubela, commandant of the revolution?
Perhaps for that very reason. He was very capable, and we trusted him back then.
Kubela, who was actually supposed to overthrow Fidel Castro, had recruited Lee Harvey Oswald for Cuban Secret Service duty, a year before the assassination in Dallas. Robert Kennedy's intermediary had hired his brother's murderer. A document from the KGB archives confirms our witness's statement. Kubela met with Oswald several times.
It's a KGB document from 1966. It states that you were the one who recruited Lee Harvey Oswald.
No, aparte eso nunca lo había oído, Eso jamás yo lo había oído. Eso es primera vez que yo lo oí. Eso es una...
I've never heard anything about that. This is the first time. An outrageous lie. I won't allow you to ask me such a question. Where then? At what location? I was never with them at the same place.
Late 1962 in Mexico.
I was only in Acapulco once with Mexican student organizations, which were very powerful in those days.
November 1962. Where were you then?
I don't know. I was only in Mexico once. Maybe this Mr. Oswald was there at the same time, and someone put the two things together. Maybe I even saw him there. No, that's too much. I wouldn't even be alive anymore. They would have taken me out a long time ago. Say the word. They can come and kill me. Lay a few flowers at my grave.
Hasta luego. Que lo vaya bien.
Kubela worked with Oswald's own left-wing fanaticism. Perhaps therein lies the answer to the question of Oswald's motive. He was ruthless and fanatical. He wanted to become a soldier of the revolution and offered his services as Kennedy's killer. We supported him in carrying out the assassination.
He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
2 days after Kennedy's murder, Lee Harvey Oswald, too, was shot to death by nightclub owner Jack Ruby.
There was no plan to save him. The assurances he was given were carried off by the wind.
Literally, the day after John Kennedy was assassinated, I went to Arlington Cemetery with Robert Kennedy and walked around the site where it would ultimately become the grave of President Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was shattered when his brother was assassinated. The sadness was really deep. The depression, I think, was deep. And I think part of it may well have been related to a sense of guilt, to a sense that his aggressive going after Castro may have led Castro to go after Kennedy.
What was the Cuban government's motive to assassinate Kennedy?
He was an enemy of the Cuban Revolution. His hostility was deep-seated. I have said all that it's possible for me to say. I have nothing more to add. I only want to make my peace, and that is very difficult. Am I afraid? No. There's just a feeling of uncertainty.
Sí es la sensación de incertidumbre.
But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town when spring trips north again this year, and I, to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous.
Fidel is a nice guy, by the way. I met him, 2 years ago in Havana. He's a smart man. He's still where he is, and he's outlived how many presidents now? I forget, 9 or 10. We ate together. We broke bread together. And he said, I'm a professional, you're a professional. We're just talking business. And that's the way it was. It was fun. He beat us. He bested us. He came out on top, and we lost.